Chapter 15, Madinah. In his book on the life of the Prophet, Sheikh Abu al-Hasan Ali al-Hassani Nadwi devotes a full chapter to a detailed picture of the social order which existed in Medina at the time when the Prophet and his companions from Mecca settled there with their brethren who belonged to that city. Such a study is very useful in the understanding of the events that took place in the following years, which witnessed the rise of the first Islamic state in history. He points out that in Medina, different faiths, cultures, and communities lived side by side to give the city a particularly rich and colorful social life. In this, it was markedly different from Mecca, which had a single faith and a single community. Here follows a summary of Sheikh Nadwi's account. It is thought that the Jews arrived in Arabia, particularly in Medina, in the 1st century A.D. Dr. Israel Wolfenson mentions that after the Jews suffered a heavy defeat at the hands of the Byzantines in A.D. 70, they sought shelter all over the world. Large Jewish groups headed for Arabia. There were 3 main Jewish tribes in Medina, whose adult males numbered more than 2,000. These tribes were the Kenuka, Al-Nadir, and Qurayza. It is estimated that the Kenuka tribe had around 700 men under arms, and Al-Nadir had a similar fighting force, while adult males in Qurayza might have been 900 in number. Relations between all these tribes were not all that peaceful. They might go to war against each other. Perhaps the other Jewish communities in Medina were hostile to the Kenuka tribe because of the latter's alliance with the Arab tribe of Khazraj. In the battle known as Buat, the other 2 tribes, the Al-Nadir and Qurayza, fought hard against the Kenuka and killed a large number of their men. At the same time, they paid ransom money for all Jewish soldiers who were captured by them. These hostilities continued after the Battle of Buat. When the Ansar prepared to fight the Jews of the Kenuka, none of the other Jewish communities was ready to join them against the Ansar. The Jews lived in their own quarters and villages. The Kenuka tribe had their special quarters inside the city of Medina after they had been expelled by the Al-Nadir and the Qurayza from their forts outside it. The Al-Nadir had their quarters about 2 or 3 miles to the north of Medina in a fertile valley called Badhan. The Qurayza quarters were situated at a district called Mazur, a few miles to the south of Medina. All Jewish tribes had their forts and districts where they lived independently, but they could not form a central authority dominated by the Jews to govern the city. On the contrary, they had their autonomy under the protection of the chiefs of the Arab tribes, to whom they paid annual tributes so that they could be secure from aggression. Every Jewish leader had an Arab ally from among the chiefs of Arab tribes. They used to boast of their knowledge of religions and laws, and they had their own schools where they studied their faith, legal code, and history. They had special places for worship, and they had their legal schools where they discussed all their affairs. Some of their laws and regulations were taken from their scriptures, while others were enacted for them by their rabbis. They had their special festivals and their days of fasting, such as the 10th of Muharram, when their fasting commemorated the Savior of Moses. Most of their financial and commercial dealings with others were according to a system based on taking pledges and usury. Since the economy of Medina had an agricultural base, it was easy for the Jews to operate their usurious system because farmers often needed to borrow money until harvest time. In their pawn shops, Jews did not only accept valuable articles as pledges, but would also take women and children as security against the repayment of loans. Such deals involving pledging one's wife or child inevitably generated a feeling of hatred between lenders and borrowers, particularly with the Arabs, who were famous for their keen sense of honor, which was overpowering in matters related to wives and children. This system, however, secured a strong financial position for the Jews, which enabled them to manipulate the market and exploit it to their own advantage. Hence, the whole population hated them for their selfishness, usury, and for the means they adopted to get rich. Their relations with the 2 Arab tribes in Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, were governed by their own interests. They would do anything which ensured any material gain. Hence, they tried to cause war to flare up between the two tribes whenever they judged that such a war would be to their own advantage. Indeed, it was the Jews who caused all the civil wars which considerably weakened both the Aus and Khazraj tribes. Their unwavering aim was to gain full control of the city finances. When they talked about the imminent advent of a new prophet, the Arabs of Medina had all the encouragement they needed to embrace Islam. The language the Jews spoke in their daily life was Arabic, with a distinct Hebrew accent, since they did not abandon Hebrew altogether, but continued to use it particularly in their prayers and scholarly work. Had they wished, the Jews would have been able to exercise a strong religious influence among the Arabs, to give Judaism firmer roots in Arabia. Students of Jewish history, however, know that the Jews were never keen to persuade people to follow their own religion. Indeed, to try to propagate Judaism is not allowed in certain cases. There is no doubt that a number of Arabs from the Aus and Khazraj tribes as well as others embraced Judaism willingly or owing to their marriage with Jews or simply because of their upbringing among Jews. One prominent Jew, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, a merchant and a poet, belonged to the Arab tribe of Tay. But his father married a Jewish woman of al-Nadir, and Ka'b was brought up as a Jew. Moreover, if an Arab lost 2 or 3 children in infancy, he might vow that if he had a surviving son, he would make him a Jew. Hence, some Arabs followed Judaism in this manner. The 2 major Arab tribes in Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, branched out of Yemeni and Azd tribes as a result of repeated waves of emigration at different times. There were several reasons for such emigration, including the conquest of Yemen by Abyssinians and the major economic setback following the collapse of the Ma'rib Dam. This suggests that the Jews were already settled in Medina when the Aus and the Khazraj arrived. The Aus clans occupied the southern and eastern areas of Medina, which were known as the upper part, while the Khazraj inhabited the lower part in the central and northern areas. There were 4 clans branching out from the Khazraj, all of whom belonged to Banu al-Najjar, who lived in the central area around the mosque, which was later to be built by the Prophet. The Aus had their quarters in the very fertile areas, living side by side with the major Jewish communities, while the Khazraj lived in a less fertile area, neighboring the Jewish tribe of the Kenuka. It is extremely difficult to estimate the Arab population in Medina, but one can make a good estimate of their fighting force in the battles which they fought after the Prophet's settlement in Medina. Their regiment in the Muslim army on the day when Mecca fell to Islam was 4,000 strong. At the time of the Prophet's emigration to Medina, the Arabs had the upper hand there. The Jews could not unite in opposition to the Arabs. Indeed, some of the Jewish clans formed an alliance with the Aus, while others were allied to the Khazraj. When they fought each other, they were fiercer in their mutual hostility than the Arabs. The enmity between the Kenuka tribe on the one hand and the Al-Nadir and the Qurayza on the other was so fierce that it compelled the Kenuka tribesmen to abandon their farms and become manual workers. Similarly, the Aus and the Khazraj fought several battles against each other, the first of which was known as the Battle of Samir, and the last as that of Buat, which took place 5 years before the Prophet's emigration to Medina. The Jews played a major part in perpetuating the hostility between the Aus and the Khazraj in order to keep them preoccupied with it. This earned the Jews the title foxes, as they were called by the Arabs. The geographical situation of Medina left it divided into several quarters, each of which belonged to an Arab or Jewish clan. Each quarter included an agricultural part with its dwellings and had another part in the form of a fort or several forts. There were 59 Jewish forts in Medina. They were of particular importance because they provided shelter, particularly for women, children, and the elderly in times of war. The forts were also used as barns for storing grains and agricultural produce. Arms were kept there as well. In addition, some forts provided a resting place for trade caravans. Moreover, the forts incorporated temples and schools with their own libraries. It is the combination of these quarters that made up the city of Medina, which meant that the city was a combination of a group of villages which expanded to become one city. The religious and social order was practically determined by the Quraysh. All Arabs recognized the authority of the Quraysh in matters of religion because the Quraysh were the custodians of the sacred house in Mecca. Hence, Arabs followed the Quraysh in their religious practices. This led to the spread of pagan beliefs. All Arabs worshipped the idols which the Quraysh worshipped, although they might have revered particular idols more than others. The idol named Manat was known as the goddess of Madinah. It was the most ancient of all idols, and both tribes of Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj paid great homage to it. Its place was next to Qadid Mount, near the sea on the road from Mecca to Medina. Al-Lat was the idol of the people of Taif, while Al-Uzza was the idol of the people of Mecca. Any inhabitant of Medina who wanted to have his own idol of wood or any other substance would call it Manat, after their main goddess. The Arabs in Medina did not seem to have a particular idol within the city which earned any great prestige, such as Al-Lat, Manat, Al-Uzza, or Hubal, and which other people would have revered. It seems that idols were not as common in Medina as they were in Mecca, where every household had its own idol. This meant that the people of Medina were simply followers of what the people in Mecca invented. The Quraysh recognized the high position of the Aws and the Khazraj, since they belonged to the major Arabian branch of the Qahtan. Intermarriages between them and the Quraysh were quite common. Hashim ibn Abd Manaf, the Prophet's great-grandfather and the master of the Quraysh, married Salma bint Amr of the clan of Al-Najjar, which belonged to the Khazraj. But the Quraysh continued to give itself the most prominent position of all. Moreover, the Quraysh looked down on agriculture as a means of livelihood. The people of Medina, on the other hand, relied on agriculture for their living in view of the fertility of their land. The economic situation was generally comfortable. Medina and its surrounding area was very famous for its dates and grapes. The staple diet of the local population was dates, particularly during periods of drought. Indeed, dates were used as currency with which it was possible to buy other articles. The date tree was also used in building and industry and as fuel and animal food. The farmland of Medina yielded a large variety of dates, and its people were highly experienced in maximizing their produce. However, this did not prevent the people of Medina from being active in commerce, albeit to a lesser extent than used to be the case in Mecca, which relied heavily on brisk import and export activity. A number of industries flourished in Medina, but it was the Jews who excelled in these. It is said that the Qenuqa Jews were experienced jewelers, which meant that they were very rich compared to other Jews and Arabs. The major crops which the land of Medina produced were barley and wheat, in addition to vegetables and different types of beans. They had several practices with respect to renting agricultural land and selling agricultural produce. But Islam forbade some of these, permitting only what involved no injustice to either party. What helped agriculture flourish, in addition to the fertile volcanic soil, was the abundance of water sources. There were numerous streams and wells, which ensured that water remained available throughout the year. Mecca and Medina had the same currency, either the Byzantine currency or the Persian one, but both were made of silver. In trade, the people of Medina used volume more than weight. They had several recognized measures of volume. It is important to mention that despite the fertility of its land, Medina could not produce enough food to meet its needs. Hence, it was necessary to import certain types of food from abroad. They used to import, for example, flour, fat, and honey from Syria. Moreover, they had a wealth of cattle, camels, cows, and sheep. Camels were used in irrigation. They also had their own grazing grounds, where many people gathered wood for burning and took their horses and cattle for grazing. The people of Medina used horses in their wars, but the number of horses they had was relatively smaller than those in Mecca. The Sulaim clan, however, were famous horsemen and imported their horses from various places. There were several bazaars and markets in Medina. The most important of all were the jewelry market of the Kenuka Jews and a textile market where silk, cotton, and other fabrics were sold, as well as the perfumery bazaars. Methods of trade were various, but Islam banned a number of practices. A small number of Arab businessmen from the Aus and Khazraj tribes based their dealing on usury, but they were very few compared to the Jews. Generally speaking, life in Medina before the advent of Islam was a comfortable one. A number of houses had more than one story, and some had their own gardens. Some people might have fetched their water supply from a distant place because they wanted the best available drinking water. They had their tools, fine objects of furniture, decorative articles, and jewelry. Women worked in weaving, sewing, and dyeing. Sculpture and brickmaking were among the skills known in Medina. In short, life in Medina was much more complex than in Mecca because of the presence of several religions, cultures, and communities. Hence, the Prophet was bound to face a variety of problems. To mold the population of Medina into a united community could only be achieved through the penetrating force of faith. Thus, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who enjoyed God's support, was the only one able to achieve that unity at that particular time. This ends Sheikh Nadvi's summary. It was into this setup that the Prophet arrived to build a coherent community and a new state. As already mentioned, his host was Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, who was extremely happy to have the Prophet as his guest. Abu Ayyub was not a very rich person, but he was very hospitable, aware that to have the Prophet as a guest was a blessing for which he had to thank God all the time. Hence, both he and his wife tried their best to make the Prophet comfortable as long as he stayed in their home. One day, a jug in which they used to keep their water was broken, and the water was spilled. They were worried lest any drop should filter through the floor and fall onto the Prophet. They rushed to dry the water using a thick piece of velvet material which they used to cover themselves when they slept. They had no other blanket. To use it to dry the spilled water meant that their blanket was wet and they could not use it that night. Nevertheless, they would have preferred to stay up all night rather than disturb the Prophet by allowing water to leak through the floor. Ayyub used to prepare dinner for the Prophet. Neither she nor her husband would eat anything before the Prophet finished his meal. If he returned the plate with some food in it, both of them would begin eating at the spot where the Prophet ate, hoping for God's blessings. With such people, the Prophet was made more than welcome for as long as he wished to stay. However, he did not wish to stay any longer than was necessary. He was soon to have his rooms built close to the mosque where he was to settle with his wife, Sauda. She was soon to be joined by Aisha, another wife of the Prophet. Shortly after the Prophet's arrival in Medina, he sent his companion, Zayd ibn Haritha, together with Abu Rafi to Mecca and gave them 2 camels and 500 dirhams. They brought back with them the Prophet's 2 daughters, Fatima and Kulthum, together with his wife, Sauda. Ruqayya, another daughter of the Prophet, had already emigrated to Medina with her husband, Uthman ibn Affan. The Prophet's eldest daughter, Zainab, remained in Mecca with her husband, Abu al-As ibn al-Rabi, who was not yet a Muslim. Zayd ibn Haritha also brought with him his own wife, Ayman, who was the Prophet's wet nurse in his childhood. She had a son, Osama, whom the Prophet loved very much. They were also joined by Abdullah ibn Abi Bakr, with the members of Abu Bakr's family, including Aisha. When they arrived in Medina, the Prophet settled them in the home of Haritha ibn al-Numan. As the Muslims who emigrated from Mecca settled into their new homes in Medina, they realized that it would be a long time before they would be able to see Mecca again. It was natural, therefore, that they would feel homesick. What made things worse for them was the fact that there was a malaria epidemic in Medina at the time. Abu Bakr and Bilal were among those who contracted the disease. Hence, the Prophet had to reassure his companions and quieten their uneasiness. He prayed to God to make Medina as appealing to his companions as Mecca was, and to bless it and to end its epidemic. The Prophet realized that he had very important tasks to which he needed to attend in order to establish his new state. The first thing he did was to build a mosque. Opposite Abu Ayyub's home, there was an open area used to dry dates. The Prophet inquired about its owner and was told that it belonged to two young boys whose parents had died. Muad ibn Afra said he would compensate them handsomely for it and that the Prophet was free to use it as a mosque. The Prophet called upon his companions to work together in the building of the mosque. He himself worked as hard as any of them. As they saw him working hard, they put in a great effort so that they could finish it in the shortest possible time. They cut down a number of date trees in the area. They leveled those parts which were uneven. Then they laid the foundation, which was about 2 meters deep. The walls were made of unburnt brick. It was a square building, about 65 meters long each way. The Qibla, for instance, the direction one faces while praying, was made towards Jerusalem, as Muslims were still facing it in their prayers. The ceiling was made of stalks of the branches of palm date trees, which did not prevent rain leaking through. No special flooring or carpeting was used. A few mats were laid down, which did not cover the whole area. Many worshippers prayed on the bare sandy floor. Next to the mosque, 2 rooms were built for the Prophet to use as a home. Similar material was used to build them, and the roofing was also of palm date branches. When they were ready, the Prophet moved in. Building the mosque was the first major step the Prophet took as he settled in Medina. He also built a mosque at Quba, where he had stopped for a few days before completing his journey to Medina. One wonders, therefore, why he attached such a great importance to mosque building. The mosque is not simply a place for worship. Had it been so, it would have been given a secondary priority by the Prophet. Muslims can pray and offer their worship anywhere. Indeed, the mosque is a symbol of Islam as a complete and comprehensive way of life. The Prophet's mosque in Medina was a spiritual center for worship. The political and military headquarters of the new state, where internal and external affairs were conducted, an institute of learning where discussion and seminars were held, and a social institution where Muslims learnt and practiced discipline, equality, unity, and brotherhood. Thus, the mosque was a place where many functions were performed. It was indeed the basic cell in the structure of the new community. From this mosque, all the great men of that era of Islamic history graduated. It was a simple place, giving magnificent results. But when mosques lost their basic role in the life of the Muslim community, they became huge, magnificent edifices which could give only meager results. The Prophet wasted no time in tackling the major problems of building the first Islamic state. One major issue to which he immediately addressed himself was the consolidation of permanent ties between the various elements which constituted the Islamic community. One must remember that the Ansar, Madinah Muslims, belonged to 2 tribes which had been until very recently at each other's throats. Both camps were full of hope that with their adoption of Islam, they substituted a permanent, unwavering tie of brotherhood for their old hostility. There was also in Medina a community of immigrants, the Muhajirin, who belonged to several distinct and independent branches of the Quraysh. Although the Muhajirin were well received in Medina, they were not used to the type of life which prevailed in that city. They were mostly merchants like the rest of the Quraysh, while the Ansar were mostly farmers. A great deal of adjustment had to be made in order to reduce potential friction to a minimum. The Prophet therefore called upon all his followers to establish a special bond of brotherhood. Each one of the Muhajirin had to be the brother of one of the Ansar. This new bond of brotherhood was different from the common fraternal ties which formed the basis of social relations within Islamic society. Those common ties of brotherhood are central in any community which adopts Islam as a faith and a code of living. The bond of brotherhood the Prophet established among the Muhajirin and the Ansar was special for the Medina Islamic society. It meant much more than a spiritual bond. It translated itself in reality into something much stronger than any tribal or family relationship. It was so real to the people concerned that a Muhajirin brother would inherit from his Ansari brother when he died, and vice versa. To illustrate how real the new bond was to its parties, one may quote the example of Abdul Rahman ibn Auf of the Muhajirin, whose Ansari brother was Sa'd ibn al-Rabi. Sa'd realized that he had to make his brother feel at home in Medina. He therefore said to him, "Thanks to God, I am quite well off, and I have decided to share my wealth with you in equal halves. I also have 2 wives. Let me know which one of them you prefer, and I will divorce her so that you may marry her." Abdul Rahman was deeply touched by this very generous offer. However, he declined to take anything from his brother. He simply asked him to show him the marketplace, where he quickly began a small buying and selling business. A few days later, Abdul Rahman went to the Prophet, who noticed that he must have had a celebration of some sort. Abdul Rahman explained that he had just got married to an Ansari lady. The dowry he gave her, as he told the Prophet, was a piece of gold equal in weight to a date stone. This little incident is indicative of the sort of feelings which existed among the 2 main groups of Muslims in Medina: an unparalleled generosity from one side and a high standard of integrity from the other. Such feelings helped mold the 2 groups into a single cohesive community, which continued to be an example for future Muslim generations to follow. Expressing their feelings at the sort of welcome they had in Medina, the Muhajirin said to the Prophet, "We have never heard of any people who are as kind as our hosts. They are the best comforters when their means are limited, and they are the most generous when they are well off. They have spared us all effort and shared with us their luxuries. We fear they will get all the reward from God while we are left with very little." The Prophet answered, "This will not be the case if you are truly thankful to them and pray to God for them." Thus the Prophet fostered firm and close relations among the Muslim community. He also had to look into his community's relations with others in Medina.